Hey guys! Tonight we float through the jasmine-sweet haze of ancient Alexandria, where scrolls outnumber houseplants, and everyone pretends to understand geometry. You wander down a stone path slick with morning dew, past linen-draped statues and colonnades, dusted in gold, and pause just outside a villa where something quite boring but quietly historic is happening. A baby is being born who will eventually become the most famous woman in mathematics for the next 1,000 years. Not bad for a Tuesday. She doesn't cry dramatically or glow with divine light. She just arrives. Hypatia of Alexandria. No goddess fireworks, no owl perching on the windowsill, no celestial fanfare. Just a father Theon who already has chalk dust on his sleeves and a twinkle in his eye that says, let's raise this child on a strict diet of algebra and humility. You probably won't survive this unless you're extremely into slow burn intellectual excellence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and post your location and local time in the comments so I can guess how sleepy you already are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The villa is modest by Alexandrian standards. It smells of beeswax figs and whatever ancient leather smells like when it's been wrapped around scrolls for 40 years. You tiptoe past low bookshelves and clay lamps until you find baby Hypatia swaddled in a wool blanket and surrounded by star charts. You blink. Yep, there's a solar diagram carved above her crib. Her father Theon is not your typical dad. He's a mathematician, astronomer, and all-around academic hermit who believes the best lullaby is a lecture on spherical trigonometry. Instead of cooing at his baby, he's probably wondering how early one can start teaching a toddler Euclidean proofs without warping their brain. Historians still argue whether Theon raised Hypatia alone or with a now-vanished wife. But what's clear is that he shaped her brain like a sculptor with a fresh slab of wax. Hypatia grows up hearing not nursery rhymes but lectures echoing down marble halls. At night, her lullabies come from planetary alignment charts and soft debates about lunar eclipses. Mainstream fact time. Hypatia was born sometime between 350 and 370 CE, a period when Alexandria was a melting pot of ideas, tensions, and quietly decaying Roman authority. And she wasn't raised to stay quiet. Her childhood world is one of scrolls and sunbeams libraries, where the candles flicker against dusty windows, where scholars drift through debates like seagulls in a wind tunnel. You join Hypatia in the background, watching her scribble strange symbols in the margins of her father's manuscripts with a charcoal stub. Here's your quirky tidbit. Theon reportedly made copies of Ptolemy's Almagest and annotated them, which basically means Hypatia's bedtime stories were heavily footnoted. She's possibly one of the only toddlers in history who fell asleep while being corrected on planetary epicycles. As she grows, the scroll count grows too. She copies everything. Treatises on number theory, notes on platonic solids, diagrams of the celestial sphere. Her father insists she walk daily, speak clearly, and dress modestly, not just because he's strict, but because he wants her mind taken seriously, in a city that wasn't built for female philosophers. By age 10, Hypatia is already asking awkward questions like, what if space curves, and yes, we're centuries ahead of Einstein here? Her tutors mostly blink. You follow her into her teenage years like a shadow, no parties, no boy band posters, just ink-stained robes and dusty debates about Aristotle. The villa never quiets. Voices echo off stone. Friends and thinkers drop by to talk about meteorological optics or how the stars relate to the human soul. You sip watery wine while a visiting teacher accidentally mistakes Hypatia for a full-grown scholar. Theon just smirks and says nothing. Historians still argue whether Hypatia traveled as a young woman to Athens or Rome maybe, but no one argues that she became the brightest intellectual in Alexandria. That reputation starts here in this cradle of candlelight and chalk. There are no grand prophecies, no magical dreams, just scrolls, hundreds of them, and the girl who will one day edit them all with the care of someone dusting off the stars. You blink and Hypatia is suddenly taller, her hair no longer in childlike curls, but now pinned up with the sort of indifference that only philosophers can pull off. She's in her late teens and Alexandria is still smoldering with debate. There's tension in the air. Pagan temples are losing state support. Christianity is on the rise, and the streets are filled with a mix of sandalwood incense and conflicting ideologies. Still, Hypatia walks like she owns the sunlight. Every morning she pulls on a white robe not too flashy, not too threadbare, and sets out to teach. Not in some candlelit back room or disguised as someone's assistant, no. She teaches openly in public in a city where women still get side-eyed for reading too quickly. You trail behind her through the streets. Men in long cloaks nod respectfully. Others raise eyebrows. Some just scoff as if her intelligence might evaporate if ignored hard enough. It doesn't. She begins lecturing at the Neoplatonist school where students come to learn not just how to think but how to transcend thought altogether. Her specialty: a blend of mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and something that feels suspiciously like mind massage. She's got the works: geometry to ground you, astronomy to elevate you, logic to shake you, and then a gentle poke with Plato's theory of forms for dessert. Mainstream fact: Hypatia was likely the head of the Neoplatonist school in Alexandria, a prestigious, mostly male institution, and she delivered lectures to packed audiences. Yes, packed. Like TikTok famous but in robes levels of popularity. Here's your fringe detail. Some sources claim Hypatia drove a chariot through town. Not a poetic metaphor. An actual horse-drawn chariot. She didn't ride side saddle. She didn't ride behind anyone. She drove it, alone, just in case anyone forgot she was a brain on wheels. Scholars still argue whether this chariot story is literal or symbolic, but you can almost see it now. Her robes fluttering behind her like scrolls on fire, students jogging to keep up. Someone shouting, "Wait!" I missed the bit about irrational numbers. Inside her lecture hall, she doesn't scream. She doesn't pontificate. She speaks with the rhythm of someone who knows you're falling asleep but wants to tuck a theorem under your pillow before you do. You sit in the back. Her diagrams on the chalkboard don't look like math. They look like spells. And the students, they adore her. Some love her mind. Some awkwardly love her more than that. But Hypatia is firm. She won't marry. She won't entertain courtship. Once a student reportedly tried to flirt and she handed him one of her used menstrual cloths as a reminder of biology's blunt indifference to romance. That, by the way, is your quirky tidbit of the night. Still, she's not cold. She listens. She explains things patiently, like why zero isn't just nothing, and how conic sections might be more romantic than poetry if you squint just right. You drift into one of her evening classes, and she's talking about Diophantine equations as though they're lullabies. In between lectures, she edits. Scrolls everywhere. Her father's texts, Ptolemy's Almagest works of Apollonius, all sharpened and clarified under her stylus. She's not just preserving knowledge, she's fixing it, making sure it doesn't wobble when the world shifts again. Historians still argue whether she wrote original treatises or simply refined others' work, but either way, her name becomes synonymous with wisdom. You get the sense that if Hypatia sneezed, Aristotle would have risen from his grave to offer her a monogrammed handkerchief. Outside Alexandria is changing. The Christian bishops are gaining power. The old gods are whispering less. Temples fall quiet. But inside Hypatia's circle, ideas are still electric. A student leans over to you and whispers that she once solved a geometry problem in 3 languages: Greek, Coptic, and sheer glare. The air around her isn't warm exactly, It's charged like the moment before a thunderstorm or a philosophical breakthrough, and yet you can tell it won't last forever. Still, for now, she remains. Hypatia of Alexandria, unmarried, uncompromised, uninterrupted for the moment, riding her chariot through the golden haze, her chalk-coated fingers gripping truths no one else dares to question. You exhale, watching her disappear into the crowd, scroll in hand, leaving only the soft echo of logic in her wake. You wake or drift, really to the rhythmic squeak of reed pens scratching across papyrus. Hypatia is already knee-deep in her morning rituals. Not incense and prayer, mind you, but mathematics and contemplation. Her study smells like old parchment and oil lamps, and you think you hear Pythagoras groaning faintly from the ether, jealous of how neatly she balances ratios. She's working with her father again, Theon of Alexandria. He's got wild eyebrow energy, scribbling so fast it's like the ink might burst into flames. But it's Hypatia who checks the margins, who pauses to rederive things with that unsettling clarity of someone who enjoys finding errors, even in the footnotes of the universe. Together they revise the elements of Euclid, updating proofs and rephrasing logic in the most satisfying ways. It's the ancient version of debugging, except instead of code, it's axioms. And instead of crashing, you end up with a better understanding of triangles. Mainstream historical fact. Hypatia is believed to have edited and improved several major mathematical texts, including those of Euclid and Ptolemy. Without her revisions, later Islamic and European scholars might have ended up with some lopsided equations. But here's the quirky bit. There's an unverified but delightful claim that Hypatia had a specially modified abacus-like device. Imagine an analog calculator, but with beads that whisper insults if you miscalculate. Okay, maybe not the insults. But the device itself may have allowed for quicker computations, proof that even in the 4th century, smart women were building their own tech stacks. Historians still argue whether she invented such a device or simply refined one from older designs. But the idea alone, delicious. You glance at her shelves piled high with scrolls labeled in a tight, methodical script. Titles like On the Motion of the Sphere or The Harmony of the Spheres sit beside more esoteric pieces. One scroll seems to be just a series of abstract diagrams. Another, a cheeky doodle of a goat. No one knows why. Maybe it's inside math humor. And yet Hypatia isn't just a mind in a study. She walks the streets too. She hosts open-air debates. Students lean against pillars while she dissects celestial mechanics as casually as you'd explain how to make tea. She talks of epicycles and deference like they're the plot twists of a bad soap opera. You nod along not because you understand every word, but because her voice makes gravity feel optional. Remember that time you got lost in a Wikipedia spiral at 2 a.m.? It's like that, but with fewer cat photos and more orbital ellipses. One day, you find yourself shadowing her at the Serapeum, that great temple-turned-academy dedicated to Serapis. The building is part library, part lecture hall, part architectural ego trip. Giant columns, polished marble, echoes that feel ancient even while still reverberating. It was once the intellectual hub of Alexandria before parts of it were destroyed. Still, some say she taught there or near it in one of the many satellite institutions scattered throughout the city. There's always noise nearby, a preacher calling for purity, a merchant hawking honeyed almonds, somewhere a donkey brays. But Hypatia rises above it, lecturing calmly. She doesn't need silence. She makes silence. People stop to listen, pulled in by the weight of her voice, the certainty of her mind. And here's the kicker. She's not preaching certainty. She questions everything. Even Aristotle, especially Aristotle. She suggests that maybe, just maybe, not every celestial model needs 55 nested spheres and a full-time babysitter. Maybe the universe is messier, more interesting, less predictable. And you feel yourself leaning closer. The city, meanwhile, simmers. Christian influence is growing. Pagan icons vanish overnight. The Serapeum is no longer the sanctum it once was. Some call its teachings blasphemy, others just call it outdated. Either way, the scrolls are being packed away or burned, or worse, rewritten. Historians still argue whether Hypatia taught within the Serapeum walls or just nearby. But one thing's certain, she inherited its legacy. A daughter of logic raised in the shadow of vanishing gods, now facing a world where ideas are beginning to rot under the weight of politics. Still, she remains calm. She folds her hands behind her back, breathes in the salty Mediterranean air, quotes Plato to a boy who just asked what stars are made of, and then she smiles faintly as if to say, "Let's keep going, shall we?" You glance down at your feet, half expecting golden ratios to spiral outward from your sandals. Because when you follow Hypatia, even the ground seems thoughtful. You wake to the soft squeak of sandals on marble, the kind of sound that belongs in a room filled with murmured ideas and sunlit scrolls. You're in Hypatia's classroom now. Or rather, her open-air forum. Because Alexandria is a city where philosophy doesn't sit behind desks. It sprawls across courtyards and colonnades, drifting in from every archway like dust in the golden light. She's mid-lecture already, of course. You've missed the first few metaphors, but no one seems to mind. That's the thing about her style. There's no pomp, no raised dais. She doesn't teach at you. She invites you in like an old friend offering figs and logic. Today's topic: the planets. Again, you're not mad about it. Hypatia paces slowly, arms folded, a faint smirk playing at the edge of her mouth. She's talking about the Ptolemaic model, the one that insists Earth sits at the center of everything like a smug melon in the middle of a fruit bowl. She quotes Ptolemy's Almagest without even looking, but there's a mischievous tilt in her voice. She knows it's flawed. You know she knows it's flawed. She knows you know. And still the performance continues like a polite roast of the cosmos. Mainstream historical fact. Hypatia is believed to have taught from the Almagest and may have corrected parts of it. Her depth of knowledge in astronomy placed her among the top scientific thinkers of her age. Somewhere near your elbow, a student jots furious notes with a stylus that's clearly too short to be comfortable. Another stares up at the clouds like they'll spell out the next theorem. A third just keeps nodding sagely, clearly, trying to impress someone, possibly Hypatia, possibly themselves. But the fringe tidbit for today. There are ancient accounts suggesting Hypatia used brass spheres to demonstrate planetary motion, essentially an early orrery. They weren't just props, they were kinetic metaphors. Moving poetry made from gears. Historians still argue whether she crafted one herself or inherited the model from earlier Greek thinkers like Archimedes. Either way, the visuals were memorable. You could see the retrograde dance of Mars and spinning brass. You can't help but marvel, not just at the model but at the method. Hypatia's gift wasn't in dazzling people with knowledge. It was in making them hungry for it. She'd break down something celestial until it felt like you could scoop it into your cloak pocket and take it home. Evenings are no less enlightening. Students gather around braziers while she recounts Platonic ideals, mathematical harmonies, or the virtue of silence in argument. You'd think all this abstract talk would get heavy, but she's got a way of balancing density with levity. Someone spills their ink. She'll weave it into a metaphor about chaos theory centuries too early. A cat wanders through the lesson. Suddenly it's Schrödinger before Schrödinger, and you're contemplating feline metaphysics. Remember when she roasted Ptolemy earlier? Well, tonight she takes a softer tone. She compares the universe to a lyre strings pulled taut by logic yet vibrating with mystery. It's one of those metaphors that sticks. You can almost hear the stars humming. Still, not everything is celestial. Politics buzz just beneath the surface of every forum and feast. Alexandria's religious identity is shifting fast. Pagan temples are being dismantled stone by stone. Christian leaders are rising, some peaceful, others not so much. Hypatia, though respected, is a known Neoplatonist. a philosopher in robes instead of robes and crosses. She doesn't pick sides, but her neutrality is beginning to feel like defiance. She continues to lecture, continues to mentor, but the tension is rising like that moment before a monsoon when the wind stops breathing and everything feels too quiet. You don't say anything, neither does she, but both of you hear it. And yet her mind stays focused. She's translating and teaching the works of Apollonius, now conics paraboles, the whole symmetrical nightmare. Students groan, one even weeps softly. Hypatia just chuckles and hands him a fresh stylus. Historians still argue whether she wrote a full commentary on Apollonius's conics or whether she simply taught from her father's notes. What's certain is that her version of these concepts made their way through generations, echoing into the Renaissance like a quiet footstep down a marble hallway. You feel the weight of the city around her, the crumbling gods, the rising tensions, the books that vanish in the night. And still she walks through it all with poise, like she knows she won't be the last to carry this light, just the current torchbearer. You watch her gather her scrolls at twilight, the orange-pink of the Alexandrian sky settling on her shoulders like a warm shawl, and you think maybe brilliance isn't about changing the world in one lifetime. Maybe it's about planting thoughts deep enough to outlive the noise. You rise early, or rather Alexandria does. The city blinks awake in slow spirals, cartwheels turning water cellars, calling parrots, yelling opinions nobody asked for. The Nile mist still clings to the air like a lazy scarf as you head back toward Hypatia's neighborhood. Today feels different, quieter. Or maybe that's just the mathematics ahead. You catch sight of her in the distance, chalk dust on her fingers, eyes sharp enough to carve triangles from thin air. She's teaching geometry again, and from the look on her students' faces, there's somewhere deep inside a proof that's making reality feel slightly optional. Today's big idea, ellipses. One mainstream historical fact. Hypatia's work with conic sections curves formed when a plane slices through a cone was fundamental to the mathematics used later by astronomers like Kepler. She may not have guessed that ellipses would one day describe planetary orbits, but she certainly grasped their elegance. She draws one, carefully whispering the steps as she goes to foci, a constant sum of distances, the tension between pole and center. It's almost romantic in a coldly logical way. The shape looks simple until you try explaining it. Like most relationships, your neighbor mutters something about circles being superior and Hypatia stops mid-line. She raises one eyebrow, the scholarly equivalent of a fencing salute, and suddenly the form becomes a gentle battlefield. Then tell me, she says, how would you describe sorrow? The poor guy stammers something about straight lines and miscalculated angles, and she simply nods. That's why circles are dishonest. They pretend things return to where they started. Laughter follows, but you feel the undertow in her tone. There's weight here. Things aren't circling back, they're tilting. The city's mood is no longer just tense, it's splitting. Which brings you to today's fringe tidbit. Rumors float around that Hypatia refused to bathe in public Roman-style bathhouses. Not because she was prudish, but because she considered them distractions from thought. She reportedly washed herself with cold water at home, Spartan silent, probably while doing mental long division. Historians still argue whether this detail was truth slander or projection. Yet it's a perfect anecdote for the image she carried, distant, disciplined, maybe intimidatingly pure. And Alexandria doesn't do well with intimidating women. You pass a wall where flyers have been pasted over with Christian symbols. Statues are being chipped down their limbs, collected like trophies. Temples gutted, scrolls quietly lifted from the library's annex and never returned. Hypatia's school, though private, is drawing eyes. The kind that don't blink. She carries on seemingly unbothered. Perhaps it's faith, perhaps she's bluffing. Back in her garden, she's mapping the stars again, this time with pebbles and wax. The students are oddly reverent. Even the brash ones sit straight. You get the sense they're not just learning, they're storing her in memory just in case. As the sun dips low, she reads aloud from Plotinus. It's an unusual choice. Philosophy, not science. She speaks of the One, the unknowable unity from which all things emanate. She speaks softly, almost sleepily, like she's telling a secret to the wind. No one breathes too loudly. Mathematics, she says, is the bridge between sensation and soul. You chew on that like it's honeycomb. Too sweet to swallow all at once. Later, while walking home, you try repeating it to yourself in a smarter voice. It doesn't quite land. She has that effect, but you're not the only one whispering her words. At a nearby market, someone mutters that Hypatia is dangerous, that she teaches forbidden things, that she controls men's minds with her eyes. It sounds absurd, but the man listening nods slowly like a candle catching a spark. Historians still argue whether this slow-growing slander came from jealous rivals, religious extremists, or just regular old fear of smart women. But the effect is clear. Whispers become sermons, sermons become slogans, slogans become threats. Back in her study, Hypatia is unfazed. She sharpens a reed pen and returns to her scrolls. She's working on a treatise about diaphanine equations, now those charmingly frustrating puzzles involving whole number solutions. You peek over her shoulder and feel your brain melt slightly. She pauses, looks at you, smiles faintly. I find comfort in problems with no easy solution, she says. You don't answer, you just nod. Because yeah, you're standing in one. You arrive a little earlier the next morning, part curiosity, part low-level worry, and find Hypatia already outside brushing fallen jacaranda petals from her bench. She doesn't acknowledge you, but that's her way. If she notices you, it's usually with her peripheral vision, and a wry comment 2 hours later that proves she did. Today's lesson isn't math or astronomy or philosophy. It's wind, not metaphorical wind. Actual sea-soaked, directionally inconsistent Mediterranean gusts. Hypatia asks her students to describe it, not measure, not calculate, just describe. The answers range from salty elbows to like Poseidon breathing down my neck. She seems pleased. Then she opens a parchment and draws the motion of wind across a sphere, tracing spirals, loops the Coriolis force before it had a name. One mainstream historical fact: Hypatia is believed to have built or improved on several scientific instruments, including the astrolabe and hydrometer tools for mapping stars and measuring the weight of liquids. It's not recorded she ever modeled wind specifically, but she certainly understood its relationship to weather, water, and prediction. You squint at her diagram and whisper something unhelpful like, so, it's like a dance. She grins. All nature is choreography. It's a nice thought, until thunder rolls in from the east. As students pack their scrolls, she asks one to stay behind Orestes, the prefect of Alexandria. His robes are cleaner than anyone else's, and his gaze lingers too long when she speaks. You've seen this look before. The one that says, I came for a lesson and stayed for the philosopher. Fringe tidbit time. Ancient sources claim Hypatia rebuffed several suitors not with poetry or polite refusals, but by showing them her menstrual rags. The point wasn't crudeness. It was clarity. She was saying this body is biology, not invitation. Historians still argue whether this story was fact exaggeration or part of later church narratives painting her as unapproachable. Regardless, the message lands: Hypatia didn't flirt. She instructed. And yet Orestes lingers. They're talking politics now, quietly, firmly. She's advising him again. On diplomacy. On rhetoric. On how to survive the unpredictable tides of public favor without abandoning moral shorelines. You cannot outyell a preacher, she tells him. But you can outlast one. He leaves eventually, face stormier than the sky. You can tell he doesn't like her advice, not because it's wrong, but because it's too right. Later, you trail behind Hypatia through the agora where someone hurls a fig at her sandals. It doesn't land, but it's a warning shot. She doesn't flinch. She simply adjusts her robe and keeps walking. People mutter. You catch phrases like witch pagan unwomanly, The mood feels like a wine barrel about to burst from pressure. Hypatia spends the afternoon in the Serapeum ruins lecturing under what used to be a temple dome. It's half charred now, Christians raised it years ago, but the acoustics still work. Her voice bounces softly off soot-blackened marble. She speaks on Ptolemy's model of the heavens. How celestial bodies move in epicycles. Circles upon circles. A cosmic illusion that fools the eye yet still predicts eclipses. You feel small beneath the broken dome, and not just because the geometry is melting your frontal lobe. Do you ever wish for simplicity, someone asks. No, she replies, but I understand why others do. The wind picks up again. Someone nearby coughs pointedly. Another throws a coin on the ground like she's a street performer. You don't like the mood, it's itchy. On your way home, you overhear a preacher shouting from the temple of Dionysus steps. He's got wild hair and a bigger crowd than usual. The word sorceress is used. So is corrupter of men. And when someone points out she's just a scholar, the preacher raises a hand and calls knowledge a false idol. Historians still argue whether this preacher was real or just a symbol of many who began turning crowds against her. But the snowball is definitely rolling now, and Alexandria doesn't get much actual snow. Just fire. Back in her study, Hypatia sketches a celestial sphere with such ease it might as well be doodling. You want to ask her if she's worried. But you already know the answer. Hypatia isn't afraid of storms. She's just annoyed by them. And she's building something now. Quietly, methodically. A new instrument. A model of planetary motion, perhaps, or just a circle she hasn't finished drawing. You don't know yet. But the curve she's tracing doesn't close. It spirals, just like the wind she mapped this morning. A sign, a foreshadowing. A loop that never returns to the beginning. You sit still watching, because tomorrow might not be as quiet. You wake up with the sound of market bells' clangs softened by the distant seagulls and the babble of vendors hawking fish that still look confused to be on land. Alexandria's harbor is already bustling sails, billowing like exhausted lungs, masts clacking like gossiping bones. Today is library day. Well, what's left of the library? Hypatia never calls it ruins. She calls it the appendix of civilization. You half think that's a joke until she explains deadpan. Of course, that appendices store useful things even when the body forgets why. You follow her into the scroll wing, a high-ceilinged hall of mismatched columns and sunlit dust. The real library. The library had been burned down long before she was born. But scraps remain. Texts copied and recopied, some wrapped in linen, others crushed between bricks like forgotten bookmarks. One mainstream historical fact, Hypatia was believed to have edited and commented on many classical texts, including works by Diophantus and Apollonius. She wasn't just teaching ideas, she was preserving the minds behind them. She lets you hold a scroll about conic sections. It smells like old lemons and moldy cinnamon. You're told to be careful, but the parchment is tougher than it looks, kind of like Hypatia herself. Across the courtyard, a pigeon poops on a marble bust of Homer. No one notices, or they pretend not to. It's probably symbolic of something. This is where you meet Synesius, a former student who now writes flowery letters and wears enough perfume to knock out a camel. He's here on business or maybe nostalgia. He greets Hypatia with a respectful half-bow and starts discussing theology. Fringe tidbit time. Synesius once wrote to Hypatia asking for help building a scientific instrument, possibly an astrolabe or hydrometer. But in the same breath, he also asked for spiritual advice. Because nothing says balanced education like mixing planetary charts with existential dread. You can tell they like each other like a compass likes a true north. But it's complicated. He's now a bishop, after all, which makes every compliment sound like a philosophical minefield. They argue quietly over the soul, whether it descends or ascends, whether its shape can be mapped like an orbit. You pretend not to listen, but it's hard not to when someone casually says, perhaps knowledge is the only immortal architecture. Outside, the sun shifts. You hear the clack of sandals approaching. Hypatia straightens just slightly. It's Orestes again. Only this time he's not here for a lesson. He's here for protection. He's been attacked stoned by a mob stirred up by someone who doesn't like the way he governs. And guess who they're blaming? She advises him someone had whispered. She enchants him. Historians still argue whether Hypatia truly held political sway over Orestes, or whether that claim was part of a smear campaign to vilify an intelligent woman during a time of religious unrest. But the rumor stuck like fish guts in a sandal sole. Hypatia listens, offers a poultice of reasoning and saltwater compresses. She tells Orestes not to retaliate in anger, which naturally makes him angrier. He wants action. She suggests patience. You sit silently as they discuss Bishop's mob's letters from the emperor. It's like watching two cats debate over how to handle a dragon. By nightfall, the streets feel sharper. People glare longer. Even the bakery smells tense. You hear someone chant her name like a curse. So Hypatia does what any rational philosopher would do. She schedules a lesson tomorrow at the old lecture circle. She doesn't flinch even when Synesius suggests postponing. They must remember why thought is dangerous, she says, because it questions what screams. You barely sleep. When dawn bleeds in like watered-down wine, you're already awake. Hypatia dresses in white not for drama but for clarity. She carries a single scroll. No guards, no shield. Just the idea that reason can walk safely through madness. Spoiler, it probably can't. But you follow her anyway. Not because you think she's right, but because you know she is. You shuffle behind her through narrow stone alleys past sleepy goats and half-swept doorways. The sun hasn't quite cleared the rooftops yet, but the city is already awake in the wrong way like a startled animal, instead of a scholar stretching after a nap. Hypatia's pace doesn't change. No cloak, no disguise, no armed escort, just a few folded scrolls tucked under one arm and the stillness of someone who knows too much to be afraid anymore. You turn the corner toward the lecture circle and pause. There's a crowd, not a gathering, a crowd. That subtle difference where people stop being individuals and start becoming atmosphere. You feel it on your skin first like humidity but thicker. Mainstream historical fact. By the early 5th century, Alexandria had become a boiling stew of theological power struggles. Pagan philosophy, Neoplatonism, Jewish scholarship, and rising Christian orthodoxy collided daily in lecture halls, markets, and sometimes fatally in the streets. And standing at the center of this boiling pot, a woman who made math feel like magic and dared to teach men how to think like planets slowly, deliberately orbiting reason. She steps up to the stone platform, takes a breath, and begins. No notes, just memory. She speaks not just about geometry or celestial spheres this time, but about harmony. Not peace, the Greeks didn't mean it that way. They meant alignment, that tuning of opposites into something almost beautiful. You're halfway through counting the patterns on her robe when someone yells. It's a short, sharp sound, cut off quickly but not forgotten. Someone else yells back. There's a push near the edge of the crowd. You can feel the moment the air changes. It always does before a riot, not loud, not sudden. Just that strange electric stillness, like every thought holds its breath. Fringe tidbit. Some ancient accounts claim Hypatia rode to lectures in a chariot not for pomp, but because walking alone had become too dangerous. Some say the chariot was symbolic, an echo of Plato's soul chariot metaphor. Others think it was just practical in a city with increasingly ugly politics. Today she walked, and now someone is throwing fruit. Rotten. Of course. Symbolism is always sticky. You duck instinctively, but she doesn't. She keeps teaching. She even smiles once at a boy holding a wax tablet in trembling hands. That's when the first stone hits. Not her. Yet, but close enough to hush the air. Historians still argue whether this was spontaneous violence or orchestrated intimidation. Some say a group known as the Parabolani monks, originally assigned to hospital work, had turned into a quasi-militant faction. Others suggest a deeper conspiracy, a kind of political theater, where philosophy played the role of scapegoat. You don't know? You just know that she turns to you, eyes calm, mouth gently amused, and says softly, "Remember this shape? It's what a circle looks like when fear tries to become a square." You don't even know what it means. Not yet, maybe never. But the phrase will lodge in your brain like a grain of sand in a clam. Annoying, impossible to shake. Eventually beautiful. The crowd breaks. Some run, some rush forward. You're pushed back hard by a wave of motion that doesn't know what it wants. You trip, fall. Hands scrape stone. When you rise, she's gone from the platform. Just a scroll remains fluttering in the breeze. Ink smudged, geometry half finished. You clutch it like a life preserver. There are shouts now, less anger, more confusion. One voice screams her name. Another says the church didn't order this. Another yells she was a sorceress. You stagger down a side alley, lungs full of dust and shame, and that awful metallic taste of helplessness. By evening, Alexandria will echo with contradicting stories. Some will say she insulted the bishop. Others will say she bewitched the governor. A few will claim she never existed at all, just a cautionary myth whispered to overcurious girls. But tonight, she's very real, and her scroll is warm in your hand. You hide it, not because you're brave, but because you're not. You don't sleep that night. Instead, you lie in the back room of a bakery whose owners owe Hypatia more than a few favors. Geometry once helped them design better ovens. There's dough rising in a bowl near your head, and the smell of yeast almost covers the fear. Almost. Outside, Alexandria simmers like an unattended pot. Shouts rise and fall, like waves too distant to make out the words, too rhythmic to ignore. You picture torchlight dancing on stucco walls and footsteps too hurried to be curious. You clutch the scroll tighter. By morning, the streets pretend nothing happened, but the chalk outlines of last night's mob still mark the stone-scuffed footprints, splintered fruit, the faintest trace of blood that someone forgot to wash, or maybe chose not to. You creep toward the academy gates. Not inside, those are locked. Just close enough to hear if someone is still alive in the shadows. Mainstream historical fact. In 415 CE, Hypatia of Alexandria was murdered by a Christian mob, likely influenced by political tensions between the city's governor Orestes and Bishop Cyril. Her death marked a symbolic end to the classical tradition of Greco-Roman philosophical inquiry in Alexandria. But that's the dramatic version. And remember, tonight's story is without the drama. So instead of screams, let's say you hear silence. Instead of a public execution, let's imagine a quiet vanishing, a missing professor, a sealed classroom, a lecture interrupted and never resumed. There's power in what's not said. Alexandria specializes in it. Fringe tidbit. Some sources claim Hypatia's bones were scattered through the streets. Others suggest she was cremated with ritual precision, a final philosophical gesture lost to fire. And yet one scroll survives curled beneath your tunic like a small sleeping animal. It's not mathematical. Not entirely. The diagram in the margins looks like a planetary model, but the labels aren't stars. They're virtues. One is ratio, another is temperance. The outermost ring reads anamnesis, the Platonic concept of remembering what your soul once knew. You trace it with your finger, half hoping it's just a student's doodle. Historians still argue whether Hypatia left behind any original writings. Some insist her works were absorbed into later commentaries attributed to her students. Others suggest fragments live on in codices mislabeled or misfiled, quietly echoing through pages she never signed. But you believe this scroll is hers because it feels unfinished. And because in the corner, tucked barely inside the ink border, she's scribbled a note in Greek. Teach this backward. Not teach this again. Not protect this. Teach this backward. You blink at it for a long time because it makes no sense. Until it sort of does. Not in a logical way, in a Hypatia way. You roll the scroll up and hide it again, this time deeper in the lining of your satchel, stitched behind a pocket you hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was always there. Or maybe you just hadn't needed it until now. Later, someone will knock on the bakery door, not to ask questions, just to say the academy is closed. The students have been dispersed. Books archived. Lecture benches cleared for public health. You nod like a good citizen, and you stay inside for 3 days. Because it's safer. Because it's smarter. Because you're not brave. Not really. But on the 4th day, you leave. Not with a plan, just with the scroll. And an ache behind your eyes that feels exactly like unfinished thought. You walk toward the docks, not for a ship, but because that's where the winds change. Where new ideas enter cities like stowaways. Where Hypatia's voice might still echo in the mast ropes disguised as sea whispers. You sit beneath a crate of exported honey and read the scroll one more time, backwards, and it finally clicks, not as a message, as a method. She was always more concerned with how than what. With the curve of thought, the arc, the way some truths only make sense in reverse. You laugh, then stop, because someone is watching you, a girl. No older than 12. Dirt on her cheeks and a look in her eyes that says she knows about stars. She doesn't ask about the scroll. She asks if you know how to draw a perfect circle. You do. You show her. She watches. Then says, that's not a circle, that's a memory. And wanders off. You stare after her stunned. And you realize something quietly horrifying and beautifully sad. That's exactly what Hypatia would have said. You don't see the girl again. Not at the docks, not by the honey crates, not in the alleys where street vendors roast fish over coals and pretend knowledge is cheap. Maybe she was real, maybe not. Alexandria is like that half mirage, half memory, wholly inconvenient when you're trying to move on. But you're not moving on, not really. You're drifting like a boat that forgot its rudder but still insists on calling it sailing. You spend the next few weeks mapping alleys in chalk. Each path labeled with what it smells like. One is fig breath, another is ink rot. One alley too narrow to walk through without exhaling is labeled contempt. You aren't sure whose, but it fits. Mainstream historical fact. After Hypatia's death, the great library of Alexandria, what remained of it never recovered. Though the institution had been in decline for centuries, her absence marked the final erosion of intellectual authority in the city. Alexandria, once the lighthouse of knowledge, became a flickering wick. But you still have the scroll, and a mind that won't shut up. So you do the only thing Hypatia would have considered useful. You teach, not formally. No plaques, no togas. You teach in doorways, on parchment scraps, to kids who don't care about philosophy until they do. One boy listens to your explanation of ellipses and immediately draws a diagram of a cat's walking path around a lazy lizard. It's an orbit, he declares, which is not how gravity works, but maybe how curiosity does. You don't correct him. The girl next to him folds her paper into a paper fish. This is a geometry fish, she explains. It swims in proof. You nod solemnly, as if this makes sense, and silently hope she never becomes less strange. Fringe tidbit. Some medieval Islamic scholars translated Greek works believed to include Hypatia's notes. One manuscript includes diagrams of celestial harmonics, alongside what appear to be dream interpretations based on star placement and date of birth. It's unclear if these were hers or just wishful misattributions. You know better than to argue with wishful attribution. Sometimes you need to believe a fish swims in proof, or that a chalk alley means something, or that your teacher's voice still rattles in your ribcage when you talk too fast. Historians still argue whether Hypatia's method was strictly Neoplatonist or a hybrid of empirical observation and Platonic abstraction. Some claim she rejected astrology altogether. Others point to coded metaphors in her lectures that suggest she saw patterns in the sky as echoes of human logic. You don't pick a side. You draw constellations on bakery walls. You calculate the area of water buckets based on their shadow size at different times of day. The grocer thinks you're weird. His son thinks you're magic. You take that as a win. One afternoon, you catch yourself saying something she once said. Truth is not a fruit to be plucked. It's a shape you must first notice. You freeze, because the moment it leaves your mouth, it doesn't sound borrowed. It sounds like yours now. You walk home under a bruised dusk sky, the kind that looks painted too thick. Clouds sag like overbaked loaves. You smell saffron in the air, maybe from a spice shipment, maybe just your imagination. You remember Hypatia once said that saffron could be used in ink if you were desperate or theatrical. You suspect she tried both. The next day, someone slips a question under your door. No signature, just 4 words. What is a circle? You don't answer directly. You draw 3 instead. One with chalk, one with string, one with breath on cold glass. Each imperfect, each undeniably true. That night you dream of a sphere that unfolds like a scroll, its surface covered in lessons too curved to read straight. You turn it over in your sleep looking for the end. There isn't one. You wake up smiling and tired. Because teaching, it turns out, is exhausting, but also addictive. You pack up the scroll again, just in case someone else needs it. Not to read, but to hold. Sometimes holding this thing is the lesson. The rest figures itself out. Some mornings you forget she's gone. It happens in the tiny acts when your hand reaches for a second teacup or when your eyes scan the market for her linen hood. It's not denial, just momentum. Grief isn't a clean tear at phrase fuzzes makes ghosts out of gestures. But Alexandria keeps turning, not kindly, but persistently. And you begin to notice how many others are afraid too. There's a woman at the divats who speaks in riddles. Unless you mention Hypatia, then she becomes clear like wine catching light. There's a librarian who still hides banned scrolls under a false floor, even though no one checks anymore. And there's a sailor who insists he saw Hypatia once calculating the tide's mood using nothing but seafoam and finger math. Mainstream historical fact. Hypatia's mathematical contributions likely included work on the astrolabe and early hydrometers used for measuring liquid density. Though most of her writings are lost, her influence rippled through students and scholars who documented their conversations with her, sometimes decades later. You don't have her formulas, you have impressions, a trail of mental breadcrumbs left in the folds of overheard wisdom and scribbled diagrams on clay pots. Some of her metaphors have survived in the strangest places: folk songs, fishermen's chants, love spells, whispered at moonrise. There's one that starts, "A straight line lies, a curve endures." You hear that in your sleep now. Fringe tidbit. A few Byzantine poets claimed Hypatia cast her eyes skyward to tame tempests, implying she used science to predict or influence weather. Historians believe this may be a confused retelling of her planetary calculations, or more colorfully, a desperate need to believe someone understood chaos. And you get that. You're knee-deep in chaos yourself. One day, while chalking out ellipses on a well lid, a stranger squats next to you and asks, "Was she real?" You know what he means. You've asked yourself, maybe she was an idea that got too large for its century. Maybe she was a quiet woman with extraordinary focus and bad timing. Maybe she's both. You answer by drawing the same circle 3 times each, slightly off. That's proof, you say. He nods like it's scripture. Historians still argue whether Hypatia authored her own texts or simply annotated those of her father Theon. Some claim her name was attached posthumously to elevate the credibility of the works. Others say the reverse, that her contributions were buried under his out of patriarchal politeness. You don't bother separating them. You teach Theon's math and call it Hypatia's echo. At night, you read dreams like star charts, hoping for a coordinate to grief. The scroll stays in your satchel. You stopped opening it weeks ago. It feels sacred now. Or sealed, or both. Sometimes reverence looks suspiciously like fear. Sometimes you need something heavier than closure. You wander into a bathhouse one afternoon and find a wall mosaic chipped and half erased. But the pattern that remains resembles a spiral map, a stylized galaxy. Beneath it, an inscription, "Where words fail, orbits speak." You don't know if she wrote it, but you trace it with your fingertip like a prayer. You spend the next few hours talking with an elderly man who claims he once debated Hypatia on the nature of zero. You try not to let your eyebrows rise too high. He says she argued that zero wasn't emptiness but potential. That's not nothing. He said, she said. That's what comes next. You write that down and circle it twice. That night, while falling asleep beneath a woven mat of sky, you think maybe the point of learning wasn't answers. It was to make uncertainty feel like a companion, like something to walk beside. You murmur to yourself before sleep. What comes next? And this time you don't mean loss. You mean lesson. You wake up to a peculiar sound. Not chanting. Not the cries of a market hawker or a scholar arguing with a tortoiseshell lyre player. No, it's the rustle of pages, lots of them. You sit up heart-thudding and realize it's coming from the temple ruins near the harbor, the ones everyone insists are quiet now. So of course you go, because nothing invites trouble quite like a building with a reputation for silence. The moment you step inside, the breeze shifts. Columns sigh. You imagine it's Hypatia herself adjusting the curtains between dimensions. But instead, you find a young girl sitting in the dust, surrounded by scattered scrolls and a look that says, caught. She's maybe 12. Her tunic is crooked, her sandals mismatched, and there's chalk all over her hands. You ask what she's doing. She says, looking for something no one believes anymore. You nod. Fair. Turns out she's heard of Hypatia. Through riddles, nursery rhymes. She thinks Hypatia once taught numbers how to behave. Mainstream historical fact. Hypatia taught arithmetic, astronomy, and philosophy, often using instruments like the astrolabe and abacus. Her school welcomed pagans and Christians alike, though not always peacefully. The girl tells you she wants to build a sun clock, but not to tell time. Just to see if light keeps its promises. You offer her a stick and a flat surface. Together you sketch out a crude sundial. She grins like a thief with a temple key. Fringe tidbit. Some legends claim Hypatia built a mirror to stop the stars from leaving, likely a poetic retelling of her attempts to map stellar movement with curved bronze instruments. Others say it was just a very shiny tray. You start coming back every day, not to teach, just to do. To draw spirals, test reflections, run experiments that end in giggles or failure or both. You learn that laughter is its own form of astronomy. It tracks the orbit of connection. Soon there are more kids, a few elders, a traveling scribe with missing fingers who still insists on sketching diagrams with his elbow. You never announce what you're doing, you just keep doing it. And the city notices, slowly, suspiciously. One day, a local magistrate stops by and asks if you have a permit. You say no. He squints at the sundial, shrugs, and says, looks accurate, then leaves you alone. Historians still argue whether Hypatia had formal support from Alexandria's governing body or merely tolerated permission due to her fame. Some suggest she had protection from high-ranking officials. Others think her influence made her a political inconvenience no one dared confront until they did. You don't seek protection. You just outlast scrutiny. The scroll in your satchel, the one with Hypatia's marginalia, you give it to the girl. She doesn't squeal or gasp. She just runs her fingers over it, then tucks it into her tunic like it's an old scarf. What if I lose it, she whispers. You reply, then someone will find it. Because that's what ideas do. They hide, resurface, mutate, spark. You realize Hypatia didn't fail by dying. She succeeded by echoing. You trace a spiral in the sand and notice how the lines never intersect but somehow keep turning back to center. Kind of like grief. Kind of like meaning. That night you dream of the library not as it burned but as it breathed. Walls that exhaled dust and theory hallways lit with curiosity instead of fire. Hypatia is there, of course. She's not speaking, just smiling and pointing at you, at the sundial, at the girl, at everything still orbiting her. You wake up remembering a smell, not of fire or incense, something older, paper, no, not quite. It's the scent of oil-soaked papyrus, the kind that clings to fingers long after you've turned the last page. The kind scribes use to coat their scrolls in to prevent decay. You're dreaming about Hypatia again, only this time she's not in the library. She's sailing, and the boat, it's made entirely of formulas. Lines of geometry stitched into the hull. equations serving as sails, an abacus for an anchor. She's steering calmly, one hand trailing in the water, calculating tides. Like it's just another morning routine: brush your teeth, chart the stars, solve for X. Mainstream historical fact. Hypatia is credited with contributions to the understanding of conic sections and edited the work of her father Theon's commentary on the Almagest, a pivotal text in Greco-Roman astronomy. She made dense math approachable and aesthetic. In short, she made math float. You watch as the ship hits open sea and she disappears over the horizon, but not in silence. A single piece of parchment drifts back towards you, caught on the wind. You catch it. Of course you do, because you're a meddler in dreams and a collector of mythological office supplies. The note reads, "You don't teach by answering, you teach by asking better questions." Quirky tidbit. It's said that Hypatia's favorite phrase to scrawl in margins wasn't a solution but a question mark. And no flourish, no commentary. Just as if daring the next reader to do more than memorize. You go about your day wondering what it means to ask the right questions. Is it asking how things work, or asking why we care when they don't? The Scroll Kids have now become something else. They've built a tiny observatory out of reeds and sun-bleached linen tied together with hope and chewing gum. It's ambitious. You respect that. One of them claims she can predict storms by watching how crickets behave. Another is convinced stars blink in Morse code. A third believes Hypatia turned into a hawk and circles above Alexandria each dawn, squawking hexagons into the wind. You correct none of them. Why would you? Historians still argue whether Hypatia saw herself as a bridge between science and mysticism. Some records suggest she dabbled in Neoplatonic thought, which blended the empirical with the transcendental. Others insist she remained purely rational with little patience for spiritual fluff. You suspect both are true. You once watched a cat do calculus with its tail and no one believed you either. That night, you return to the ruins alone. You place a piece of chalk in the center of the sundial, not to mark time, but to remind yourself that time always returns. Then, without meaning to, you begin whispering questions into the dark. What was your favorite shape? Did you ever hate teaching? Were you scared that day? Did you know they'd forget you? And quietly, did you think it would be enough? A breeze flutters the edge of your cloak. Something rustles in the olive trees nearby, and just for a second you hear chalk scraping stone. Not from you, from the past, or the future, or maybe just from someone like you years from now doing exactly this, looking for the questions no one answers, leaving behind the ones worth repeating. You sit cross-legged until the moon rises over the temple columns. Then you lay back and stare at the stars, trying not to solve them, just letting them be, like punctuation in the sky. You spend the morning inside Hypatia's old lecture hall. Though hall is generous, it's more of a sunlit ruin now, vines curling over broken thresholds, benches worn into smoothness by centuries of elbows. You find the seat where she supposedly used to sit, the one facing everyone but slightly off-center. Strategic. Probably so she could draw circles on the floor without elbowing anyone. You take that seat, then you do the most logical thing imaginable. You pull out a stick and start drawing circles too. Perfect ones are hard, your hand shakes. The dust doesn't help, but it feels right to try. Mainstream historical fact. One of Hypatia's key teaching tools was the astrolabe, an ancient Greek instrument used for solving problems related to time and the position of the stars. She didn't just teach math, she taught how math mapped the heavens. A cosmic GPS that worked before satellites and smartphones. So yeah, you doodle in the dirt. But you're basically an astronomer now. Congrats. The kids return, of course. They always do. They plop beside you like sleepy satellites caught in orbit. One has found an old lens, likely from a broken lantern, and insists it's a truth magnifier. You nod gravely and ask what they've seen through it. Mostly bugs, they whisper. But one of them had opinions. Quirky tidbit. According to one medieval legend of questionable reliability, Hypatia once designed a magic mirror that could show a person not their reflection but their inner flaws. Naturally, no one wanted to use it twice. Or maybe that was just an early prototype of Twitter. As the sun hits its zenith, you decide the heat is a signal to explore the archives. Not the grand ones, the dusty ones. You descend a half-buried stairwell expecting silence. Instead, you find laughter. Not recent. Echoed. Long ago, some philosopher laughed too hard at a bad pun, and the acoustics carried it forward, like an audio fossil. You imagine Hypatia smiling at that. She was surrounded by intellectual giants, some friendly, some fragile. She had to navigate ego, envy, and erratic footnotes. Historians still argue whether Hypatia held any formal political power. While widely respected by the elite, especially the governor Orestes, there's debate about whether she advised on civic matters or remained strictly academic. Some say she had the city's ear. Others claim she barely had tenure. You dig all through a collapsed chest and find what might once have been lecture notes. Or maybe shopping lists, hard to say. Ancient shorthand is notoriously vague. One reads, "circle within a circle." See where it breaks. Another simply says, "not everything beautiful needs purpose." You sit there a while, letting dust settle into your clothes. You're not sure if you're learning or just listening really hard. But it's quiet here, and sometimes quiet is the best place to understand things. You imagine her voice filling the space. Not loud, not stern, just sure. Not because she knew everything, but because she knew enough to keep asking. Back upstairs, a new scroll has been nailed to the olive tree. You're not sure who put it there. It reads, "The hardest lesson is learning how to pause your mind." You smile. That's probably true. And wildly inconvenient. You lie back on a carved bench and watch the clouds pass through the columns. They look like graphs of moods you'll never explain. A drifting thesis with no conclusion. Just space. A good lecture doesn't end. It just fades into questions. You wake to the scent of ink and dust. Or maybe that's just your imagination brushing against the edge of a memory you've never had. The olive tree outside sways, gently dropping the occasional leaf like punctuation on the wind. You rise slowly. The city around you hasn't changed, but your eyes have. There's something about spending too much time in a place like this. Alexandria, for all its crumbling and burning, still radiates quiet defiance. It's a city that keeps whispering, "You won't remember every word, but you'll remember how I made you feel." You trace the morning light as it falls across Hypatia's old chalkboard marble slab. There's a fresh mark carved beside her diagrams. A curve so precise, so impossibly smooth, you almost wonder if the stone itself softened to obey her. Mainstream historical fact. Hypatia's teachings weren't limited to math and astronomy. She also edited and improved many classical texts, including her father Theon's commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest. She wasn't just a transmitter of knowledge, she was a curator, polishing ancient ideas until they gleamed anew. It's not flashy, but it lasts. And you're starting to realize that Hypatia didn't set out to be famous or tragic. She just showed up every day, scribbled circles, asked questions, listened better than most. That's it. That's the work. You meander toward the marketplace, now filling with bread sellers and gossip traders. Someone bumps you with a basket of olives. You take one and nod like a philosopher. A pigeon lands on your shoulder. Bold. Probably judgmental. You ask if it has any thoughts on Neoplatonism. It poops. Fair. Quirky tidbit. Some ancient sources claim Hypatia kept a pet crow that could recite fragments of Plato in Greek. Others suggest it just screamed whenever someone used bad logic. Both are equally delightful. You stop at a fountain and watch coins shimmer at the bottom, wishes flattened into metal. A child tosses in a pebble and makes a wish out loud. "I want to be smart and weird." You silently echo that. Historians still argue whether Hypatia's death marked the end of classical learning in Alexandria or whether it was simply one of many tragic footnotes in a centuries-long decline. Some call her the last true scholar of antiquity. Others say she was just one of many stars extinguished before dawn. But here's what matters to you now. She was real. She made time for hard thoughts. She taught by existing fully. And that makes you feel a little less alone in your own thinking. As the sun dips lower, you wander back to the lecture courtyard. Someone's drawn a new circle in the dust. It's imperfect, but so were hers probably. You sit beside it and hum softly, just a tune you remember from nowhere. A breeze lifts your hair and you swear it whispers. Keep asking. It's not a command. It's an invitation. And somewhere on a cosmic chalkboard made of stars, another set of concentric questions begins to spin. You settle back against cool stone, the last light of Alexandria, melting into copper behind the skyline. The shadows stretch longer now, softer, like ideas that don't need to be solved, only held gently for a while. The olive tree's leaves rustle just above you, each one a lullaby that never had to rhyme. You listen to them fall one by one like punctuation marks, closing a long, rambling letter from a friend who always knew you'd understand eventually. Your breathing slows. The marble bench beneath you doesn't ask questions. It just supports. You close your eyes and think about that spiral carved into the floor, how it didn't need to be perfect to be meaningful. How even Hypatia, with her boundless intellect, chose to draw on dusty stone, knowing the wind would erase it. That's okay. Sometimes the point isn't permanence, it's presence. The air carries the scent of baked bread and sea salt, and somewhere in the distance a bell rings without urgency. As if to say, it's fine, tomorrow can wait. You nestle into the quiet. The stars above begin to blink open, tiny circles watching over you, like tiny scholars of the night. And there you are in a city of scrolls and echoes of questions with no pressure to answer. Just drifting. Just here, held by history and rocked by the rhythm of thought. Sleep follows softly.